In this video, I'm going to show you how you can use shape language to drastically improve your character designs and how the masters at Disney, Pixar, and other amazing animation studios do it. To start things off, the big question, what is shape design and is it something that I really need? Don't people just draw characters and leave it at that? Well, I mean, that is one way of drawing and approaching characters, but if you ever want to design a wide cast of characters that need to all look different from one another, have different personality traits, or it could just be that you're stuck with drawing characters that all feel the same or look the same, that's when you would start thinking about the shape design of your characters. In fact, a lot of your favorite characters from movies, shows, video games, and comics use shape design and shape language to help make their characters stand out. A good character designer will usually use some element of a shape to help design their characters, or at least just to get them started. Whether it's super straightforward and direct or subtle and a bit more abstract, some element is being used. And a great example that I love to use is from the movie Up, a Pixar movie that a lot of people love. The designers of the film really knew how to take the basic shapes and turn them into characters. Now obviously Pixar still has a somewhat realistic style to them, but by just following the simple rule of using shape language, they were able to get a nice variety in shapes amongst their main cast of characters. So here I'm going to be using the characters from Up to show you how the designers use different shapes to separate the look and silhouette of the main characters in the movie. A lot of the times I find that when we're designing human characters or human-esque looking characters, they end up feeling quite similar to one another, and that's because when we're drawing characters that are human, we give them similar proportions, they have similar features, and it ends up becoming a little bit harder to separate them visually. But as you can see with the characters from Up, they very clearly used shapes to separate each of these characters. Carl being square, Russell being circle, and the triangle being for Kevin, and a rounded square for Doug. So Doug's a little bit of an exception. He's like a combination of the circle and the square. But even so, by just doing this, changing the proportions, warping them a little bit, and arranging the shapes in different ways, it makes these characters feel very separate and different from one another. And by doing this, it makes them feel more like individuals rather than a similar cast of characters. This also helps that when these characters are on screen, we can identify them a lot faster and a lot easier, and it creates for a nice combination of shapes when they're all on the same screen. These shapes that I just used to break down the characters from Up, yeah, that's all you need. It's as simple as using a square, circle, and a triangle. Now, don't get me wrong, the concept is super simple. It's just 3 shapes. Shapes that we're familiar with since we were babies, but it is a tough one to master. And that's because there are so many different ways that one can use these shapes and how someone can decide to apply them. So that means how you decide to organize them, the order in which they're organized, their proportions, maybe they're warped, so on and so forth. Already, you can kind of see that the possibilities are pretty much endless. And this hasn't even gotten into line weight, colors, and rendering, which pretty much define what an artist's style is going to be. So the next big question is, how do we use shape design? How is it applied? Well, we saw a little bit of it with the Up example, but that was only one way of applying shape design and shape language into our characters. So now it's time to get a little technical with definitions because we are going to be using these words a lot. What is shape design and what is shape language? Like, what do they even mean, and are they even different from one another? This is going to be an oversimplification of what these terms mean, but it gets across the general idea for the purposes of designing characters. Shape design is when we take the literal shape and apply it in a very obvious way onto our characters. So previously, I used the characters from Up, and I would say that Up is an example of using the literal shape to help design those characters. But another great example of the shape being used literally in the design of the character, where their shape is even in their name, and that character is SpongeBob. He is literally a square. Sometimes it's really as easy as that. And the neat thing is that usually you will find this a lot with characters from animated TV shows. And that's because, for one, it's easier to animate, but two, it creates some really memorable silhouettes and designs because of how simple they are. Think about characters like Mickey Mouse. He's just 3 circles stuck together, and voila, you have a character. Another example is Phineas and Ferb, right? Phineas has a triangle for a head. Like, that's it's kind of bizarre, but it's as simple as that. So those examples are how we can take shapes and use them to help us design simple but memorable characters. Usually though, this is applied a lot, but not limited to really cartoony looking characters. So the next one is shape language. Shape language is when we take aspects from shapes and apply them to characters. So for example, if we were to use a square is boxy, it's large, chunky, squat, has 90-degree angles, and has very flat, even sides to it. You might be thinking, great, we just described a box. How does that help with designing characters? I'll switch it up and I'll use another animated series with a completely different style to show what I mean. So for shape language, I'm going to be using characters from the show Legend of Korra, which was a spin-off of Avatar: The Last Airbender. And I'm going to be using Mako, who's on the left-hand side, and Bolin, who's on the right-hand side. And I want to show how the designers use different shapes to kind of help break down or make these characters feel a little bit more different and individualistic from each other. Now, for shape language, I find that it's a lot more helpful and a lot more useful when we're using it with realistic characters. It's not exclusive to realistic characters, but it helps a lot more. Because when it comes to more realistic characters, we don't really get that much of an opportunity to exaggerate or distort the proportions or forms of these characters. So for shape language, it helps to really just take qualities and aspects of the shape and just keep them in mind as we're designing the characters. And as you can see for Bolin, he's a lot more square, his head's a lot wider, his body's a lot wider, and everything is a bit more parallel. Whereas if you look at Mako, who's very much based on the triangle shape, he's a lot pointier, his hair comes up literally to a point, his face is a bit longer and pointier, not as wide as Bolin's, and a lot of his body shape and silhouette converges to a single point, which then again allows for that more triangular feel to his body design. But using shape language also helps communicate who they are as characters. So Mako is a lot more dynamic, he's more action oriented, jumps around a lot, and that's because his bending abilities, or his superpowers I guess, if you've never watched the show, is that he can control and manipulate fire, which is again a lot more dynamic, a lot faster, and in essence the fire shape itself is also pointier. Whereas Bolin, he has rock powers, so he's usually more planted with his 2 feet on the ground, his character is a lot more grounded, and his ability to control rocks also kind of needs him to be a bit heftier and slower and a bit more grounded. And rocks, their shape in general also is a lot boxier and bigger. Using shape language doesn't mean you have to completely distort or exaggerate the shape of these characters, but you can use qualities from the shape and kind of stick them to the characters to help just make them look a little bit more different and a little bit more identifiable from one another. You can help support us as we continue to make free arts education by becoming a member on Patreon or YouTube. This will give you access to special perks like critiques and classes. So shape design and shape language are 2 of the main ways we use shapes to help us design characters. But there's one more approach, and this one is kind of interesting, and that is how we sometimes associate personalities with shapes. Shapes aren't there to just physically define a character, but it can also show their personalities. So for the square shape, we associate it with words like strong, stubborn, stable, rigid, and/or dependable. For a circle, it's soft, organic, fluid, flexible, adaptable, and/or friendly. For a triangle, it's usually linked with wild, unpredictable, outgoing, energetic, and/or dangerous. So if you think back to our up example, you can kinda actually see that in how those shapes are also associated with their personality. Carl's kind of grumpy and rigid. Russell is friendly and approachable. And Kevin, he's wild. I mean, he's a wild bird. And Doug, because he's a rounded square, he's loyal, which is kind of like stubborn, but he's also friendly. But like I said before, I don't want to keep using Up as an example. So for this one, I'm going to use Disney's 2D animated film Mulan because it perfectly captures and takes advantage of this shape principle. So we're going to be using Ling to start us off with the shape association. And a lot of the times we can use shapes to help us get a subtle indication of who these characters are, their personality traits, and just give a first impression as to their behavior and who they're like. So with Ling, he's very pointy, he's kind of lanky and long, and his poses are also a lot more dynamic, and this perfectly fits with the triangle shape. His head's pointier, his hands are thinner, and his forearms kind of also come to a point. But not only is the shape language applied to his character design, but it matches his personality really well. He's kind of a wild and eccentric person. He's not mischievous necessarily, but he's not like super friendly as we'll see with some other characters. So again, he's kind of a wild card. Now if we move on to Yao, he's very clearly using the square shape. He's a lot wider, very boxy, and if we compare his hand shape to Ling's hand shapes, it's definitely a lot larger and more square-like. Whereas Ling has a lot of converging points similar to Mako in our previous example, Yao is a lot wider, kind of like Bolin, but he's definitely a lot more wider as, you know, with Disney films they tend to exaggerate the proportions a little bit more. And as for personality, again, fits really well with the square shape as he's a grumpy, stubborn, proud person that gets angry pretty easily. And our last character is Chenpo. And for him, he's probably like the easiest to spot which shape is being associated with him, as his head is essentially made up of 2 circles, and then his body is 1 big circle, and then everything else is just these big sweeping curves. So Chenpo, pretty straightforward. He's going to be the friendliest, kindest, most easygoing character out of the trio of these characters in Mulan. And these are ways of just how you can use the shapes to help the audience get a sense of who these characters are and who their personalities are. It doesn't always have to be this straightforward, but it can help. Another example is like Inside Out, where the anger emotion is emoted by a very blocky, chunky, red kind of character. So as you can see, it can be used in different ways. Sometimes it's very straightforward, and sometimes it can be applied in a little bit more of a looser kind of a way. But shape associations can always help you get started and get you kind of hit the ground running if you're stuck trying to come up with character designs. So as you can see with these 3 characters, they really took advantage of the 3 basic shapes and the associations that those shapes have with personality traits. But with that being said, what you'll notice is that that's not exactly true for a lot of characters, and that's why I like to think of this quote-unquote rule as more of a jumping off point rather than a hard rule that I can't break. Now don't get me wrong, using shapes and the associations that those shapes have can really help get the creative juices flowing and hopefully get you started with a design so you don't get stuck. Sometimes it can be extremely well implemented in the design and the personality themselves, like demonstrated with Mulan. But other times it's not used at all, like in SpongeBob. And so that's the neat thing about art and design, is that rules are there to help get you started, but it doesn't mean you have to stick to it to completely be successful in your art. So the main takeaway is that using shapes can help build variety in the designs of your character, whether it's implemented in the way they look, their personality, or just subtly hinted at. Using shapes can really help with creating your characters and hopefully allow you to start creating a wide variety. Join a virtual class to start learning from our professional artists. Get creative assignments, individual guidance, and real-time feedback on your artwork. Start today and level up your practice. If you learned something new, please like and share with a fellow art nerd, and if you love receiving quality and free arts education, subscribe. Here's a couple other videos you can check out next.